It is December 30th, 2025, and Trump is once again threatening to bomb Iran as he stood next to Netanyahu outside of Mar-a-Lago and declared that the U.S. was ready for the next phase of war and that Iran should know the consequences. But what would that actually look like, as Iran has spent the last 6 months preparing for the next phase of war, preparing for a possible attack, and making it clear that every time they retaliate, that the price that Israel is forced to pay will be increased each time. All of this comes as the Iranian president is saying publicly that his country is at war with the West because the US and Israel and Europe, they do not want Iran to be a stable country. If they did, they wouldn't be targeting it with all of these economic sanctions and trying to make it sound as if Iran is on the verge of collapse at any moment, while also insisting that it is the world's greatest threat. So, what should we be keeping an eye on as we go into the new year? Well, we got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier. So, let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Syed Mohammad Marandi, a professor at the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope you and your audience have a very good year ahead of you, and I hope you've enjoyed your Christmas too.
Thank you so much. It's great to have you on the show. And yeah, I cannot believe it's almost 2026 here, but it seems as though we couldn't get through the year, couldn't get through 2025 without Netanyahu making one last visit to Trump. This time he went to Mar-a-Lago, of all places, to meet in person with Trump on Monday. And Trump went from gushing over Netanyahu, he then turns around and he's like, oh, yeah, we haven't forgotten about war with Iran threatening to bomb the country again. And I thought it was interesting that the Washington Post did report that support for additional strikes against Iran was on Netanyahu's wish list for this visit. But they are, of course, also still dealing with the genocide in Gaza, so they have to figure that out as well. So, how do you see this visit, and should we be concerned when Trump and Netanyahu are getting together in person again?
Well, Trump, Netanyahu, and Biden are the three main ringleaders for the Gaza genocide. So it's always concerning when the three of them talk about anything. I think that Trump, of course, he is constantly flip-flopping, and his position changes very rapidly on different issues. The Ukrainian issue is just one such example, but there are many. So I don't think anyone in Iran really, anyone of importance in the state, decision makers. I don't think any of them take anything that he says seriously, whether it's Trump or Netanyahu, about waging war or about not waging war. The government and the state, they are, and the armed forces, they are preparing the country for war. And as they say, the best way to prevent war is to be prepared for war. I think it's pretty clear that 6 months after the war, the Iranian armed forces today and the administration, the government, they're much more prepared for war than they were back then. And if the Israeli regime or Trump, they decide to launch another war, I think it will be much worse for them than last time around. But in any case, Netanyahu is a person who needs war and crisis and crises to stay in power. And if he is removed from power, he'll probably or possibly go to jail, because now that even the judiciary is being weakened. So, but he's still in trouble. His wife is also in trouble, and she's a powerful figure as well. So we should always expect trouble or death and destruction and slaughter as long as Netanyahu is in power. And he is doing that, by the way. Every day he's murdering people in Gaza, and The same is true in Lebanon. In ever since October the 7th in the West Bank, there have been well over 1,000 deaths, murders. And in Gaza, since the so-called ceasefire, we've had well over 400 murders. And in Lebanon, they're assassinating people on a daily basis, civilians. They don't care, and neither does the Western media. Just 2-3 months ago, a family in southern Lebanon was murdered. 3 kids, all of them American Lebanese. Their father was murdered, American Lebanese, but the U.S. Embassy, Western media, the State Department, the U.S. government, none of them. They were completely indifferent. So, as long as Netanyahu's there, you can expect people to die.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up. And you're right. When I see Trump and Netanyahu together, I mean, they could come out and say that they want world peace, but we have seen absolutely no indication that they are going to give us anything other than more and more genocide and more war. And I thought it was interesting. You've got Trump's threats that of course he talks, he's always talking. Well, then we saw that the Iranian president Masoud Pezeshkian published a post on X that said, quote, "The response of the Islamic Republic of Iran to any oppressive aggression will be harsh and regrettable." Now, that's according to Google's translation. But Iran has been warning the US and Israel for months that its retaliation is going to increase each time it is attacked. So, how do you see these kind of building tensions here? And as you were noting earlier, Iran is more and more prepared, but do you think that the US and Israel fully realize what they would be getting into if they were to carry out another attack?
No, I don't think they calculate correctly. They miscalculated the first war. They thought that they will be able to undermine the state and carry out what they like to call regime change. But after, I don't know the exact time, but after 5 to 6 days, the Netanyahu regime was asking Trump to get a ceasefire. And Steve Bannon was the first after the ceasefire who I recall came out and said that the hidden story of all this was that Israel was in very bad shape and that Trump basically saved them by getting this ceasefire deal after 12 days. So today, if it's restarted, the Iranians are far more prepared than they were last time round. And it will be much more difficult to surprise the Iranians the way they did. But I don't think they see it that way. The Israelis, they are supremacists. And so people who are supremacists, they always underestimate everyone else. And the United States government is also exceptionalist. In a way, it's sort of like a supremacist, the same sort of supremacist worldview. They see themselves as exceptional, and therefore they always look down at everyone else. That's why China is always collapsing, Russia is losing the war, Iran is always on the verge of collapse, because they cannot really digest the notion that these states are legitimate, that they're powerful, that they are competent, and they're capable of defending themselves. So I don't think that they read the situation accurately, but also from my understanding, from what former intelligence officers have said, some of them are, I think, have been on your show. Intelligence in the United States today has been much more politicized than it was in decades past, in many decades past, like 50, 60 years ago, 40 years ago. And that, of course, makes it all the more problematic. But what is the good thing is that people across the world are waking up to the empire. People across the world dislike Netanyahu, and Americans, who are the most propagandized people in the world, they too are waking up. The anti-genocide protests over the last 2 years, they were led in many instances by young university students, many of them Jews. So people from all walks of life, from all religions, from different ethnic groups and races, even in the United States where the media machine is very powerful, they are waking up. So that, I think, is probably the most um, important element in all this, that despite all the horrors that we've seen over the last 2 years and 3 months, there has been an awakening across the globe, but most importantly in the United States, which is the main backer of the Israeli regime, that will make it much more difficult in future for the regime to behave in the way it does among the left, among the liberals, among independents, and now increasingly among the right. We see major figures in the right breaking away from MAGA, um, and you hear the division between the American firsters and the MAGA. Now that this has very much to do with Netanyahu and Zionism and the Israeli regime.
Yeah, and you can see that Netanyahu is starting to get desperate, right? He's like clinging to Trump, knowing that, okay, I've only got a few more years left of at least this version of a US administration that seems to be all gung ho for whatever it is that Israel wants. And I thought it was interesting because Trump released his national security strategy for his second term. And it seemed as though they had almost kind of forgotten about the Middle East, right? The focus was on bringing back the Monroe Doctrine, conquering the Western Hemisphere. It seemed as though we were all set for war on Venezuela. And so I'm curious too, when you look at the timing of Netanyahu's visit, does it seem like the goal there was to kind of bring Trump's focus back to the situation, be it the genocide in Gaza and this push to quote unquote disarm Hamas or a future war with Iran? Does it seem like that was the push, or is this all just a show at the end of the day and we shouldn't really take this document too seriously?
Well, when it first came out, I was interviewed like by a couple of people, and this question was they asked me about this, and I said I don't believe this document is ever going to be implemented, and that the United States, as long as this regime exists and this current political regime in the United States is in power, they will continue to support it. And so I don't really, I don't think that the document, I don't take it as seriously as some people do. But what I do think is important is that the Israeli regime, not only has it become immensely unpopular and it's delegitimized itself in the eyes of the world, but it has failed in the war against Iran. It has not succeeded in Lebanon. It never defeated Hezbollah. It never gained any foothold in Lebanon. It only gained some territory after the ceasefire, in violation of the ceasefire, because of the incompetence of the Lebanese government. They failed in Yemen, and they haven't been able to take Gaza, and the Gazans are rebuilding their defenses, no doubt. And of course, Iran would definitely be supporting them. So the Israelis, the only place where they had some success was in Syria. And of course, Trump thanked Erdogan yesterday for that. He said that, he helped us get rid of the previous government. And he said Netanyahu agrees with me on that. In other words, it's Netanyahu and Trump is basically admitting that Netanyahu, Trump, and Erdogan, and of course Biden, they were all on the same page when it came to Syria, which I think is a fascinating admission. But beyond all that, the Israeli regime has overextended itself. We've just heard that the United Arab Emirates is pulling out its armed forces from southern Yemen. We see a big divide growing between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which is the UAE is probably the closest ally of the Israeli regime in our region. Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, all of them cooperate with the regime, but the relationship with the UAE is something special. And the Saudis have this divide is not good news for the Israeli regime, whether it's in Yemen or in Somalia or in Sudan. It's not good for them. And also the shameless alliance that the Israelis are creating with Cyprus and Greece. I mean, regardless of the relationship, who's right and who's wrong, but in the relationship between Greece and Turkey, that's one issue. But to align yourself with a genocidal regime against Turkey is, I think, going way too far. But this is pushing Turkey, which now feels vulnerable because it didn't get what it sought to gain in Syria. Now it's feeling pressure from from the Israeli regime and its allies. It's tilting towards Iran, and the Turkish president is going to visit Tehran shortly. So the regime has gone too far, I think, and it has overextended itself. It has lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the world. It, as I said, it had a few tactical victories, but I think strategically this has been a major failure for the regime. All of this, the whole 2 years and 3 months.
Yeah, I'm with you. You look at their actual long-term gains, and exactly as you were saying, it's really about the long-term awakening. And I thought it was interesting too, one other note that we heard from the Iranian president, he described the current state of tensions on Saturday by saying, quote, "We are in a full-scale war with the US, Israel, and Europe. They don't want our country to remain stable." He also said that the West war against Iran is more complicated and more difficult than the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s. Now, Iran is not just being hit with direct attacks, but also with economic sanctions. You've got reports here in the West that are really highlighting recent protest over surging inflation and currency concerns. So, how do you view the current state of the West war against Iran, where they may not necessarily be bombing right now, but they're still doing everything that they possibly can with the ongoing sanctions targeting the Iranian people?
Yes, the sanctions are basically there to hurt ordinary people, to kill people, to destroy their lives. It has nothing to do with governments, whether it's Iran or Venezuela or Cuba, it doesn't make a difference. The target is ordinary people. It's intended to make people make them desperate, to make them fall to their knees, and then out of desperation undermine their governments and do the bidding of the West, and so that the West can get what it wants. Or in the case of Venezuela, Trump was very blunt about it. We take back our oil and our land and all that. Anything that, I mean, very blunt, very brief. This is how I would put it. Anything that you see in the Western media, it doesn't matter if it comes from the liberals or the conservatives. Mainstream Western media is never honest about Iran. I do not ever recall reading a single article from beginning to end where I said, wow, this is like a good article. It is always full of disinformation and misinformation and twisted truths. And so people, and that creates a false understanding in the West, even among Western elites. They think Iran is always collapsing. Well, that's what they've been saying about Russia too for 4 years. That's what they've been saying about the Chinese economy for decades. That's what they've been saying about Iran for decades. No, Iran is not going to collapse. Iran is not going to be undermined or overthrown, and they can't come to terms with this reality. So if there are demonstrations in Iran, or if there are riots in Iran, or if there's unrest somewhere in Iran, in a country of 91 million, doesn't mean anything is going to happen. When General Soleimani, where it's his anniversary around now, when he was murdered by the Americans, we saw millions of people come to the streets for his funeral. So are these people the ones who are going to overthrow the state? The problem in the United States is that they make this propaganda and they believe their own propaganda. And so even President Pezeshkian's statement, when he made that statement, it was twisted in the West. They said that he was declaring war on the West, whereas he was just stating a fact, saying that the collective West is out to undermine Iran. But they make it as if he's the one who's declaring war on the West. That's the situation that we live in. But the good news is that, especially after Gaza, people are waking up to the reality. Mainstream media is discredited. I mean, when I'm on your show, and I compare it to when I'm on mainstream Western media, your audience is larger than on ordinary occasions when maybe if some conflict between me and the host takes place and it becomes there's sparks or something like that, I may get there may be a larger audience, but your audience is very large. And the same is true with some of your friends and colleagues, people that you and I both know and like. And the Western media doesn't have the sort of influence that it had 5 years ago. And you see that playing out in U.S. politics itself, whether it's Candace Owens now, whose whose uh, viewership has gone through the roof, or Tucker Carlson, or even Steve Bannon, and these people with their differing views, they now have more influence than the mainstream media outlet. So I'm not as worried, or I'm not as, I shouldn't say worried, but I'm not as concerned, or I don't care as much about the influence of Western media now than a few years ago. Of
Yes.
course, censorship is on the rise, social media is clamping down. I get all that, but still I think that they've lost control, the powers that be.
Yeah, you can only promote endless war and genocide for so long. And exactly as you were also noting, one day they'll come out and they'll say, oh, Iran is on the verge of collapse. The government is going to fall. And then the next day, Iran is the greatest threat to the world that we've
Oh
ever heard of.
yes,
So,
fantastic example. I mean, how do they combine these two things at the same time is beyond me. How can a regime, as they like to call it, that's on the verge of collapse, deeply despised, incompetent, corrupt, hated universally, how can it be a growing threat and menace to not just the region but to the entire world at the same time?
yeah, that is the $64 million question that they definitely don't want the public to ask. But I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing to continue to challenge the mainstream media and really the Western narrative, both on the mainstream media and over here in the alternative media. Syed Mohammad Marandi, a professor at the University of Tehran, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.